There we are. All right, I believe we're starting the broadcast as of now, so let me add this over to screen. And we'll give a couple of minutes for everybody to join. And perhaps if you are in the session, just over the next 30 seconds or so, if you guys want to comment as to where you guys are logging in from today, and we will kick off the session shortly. I see a couple of comments coming in from a couple of teammates, which is great. And let's keep fingers crossed that some of the technical issues that we saw in our first session are kind of gone. Wonderful. Buffalo, New York, Toronto. Wonderful, Atlanta, Georgia, and I know we definitely have some from overseas. So why don't we start off today's session? And of course, I've shared a quick little slide here, and so it's great to welcome everyone to our next session of TMF Week. And just as a quick introduction, my name is Michael Pupil. I'm the head of sales at Montreal. Incredibly excited to see you all here at today's session, and I know how hard our speaker, Francesca Darmer, has worked in putting this together. So maybe just to cover a couple of housekeeping items, and a quick reminder for everyone to feel free to use the Q&A section to submit questions at any time throughout the presentation. We're of course going to dive into Q&A at the end of the webinar. Each attendee is of course going to receive a record of attendance, and most of the session recordings and presentations will be made available next week on your TMF dashboard. So it gives me great pleasure to jump into today's session, the benefits of AI in eTMF, how to better your overall eTMF health and quality with new technology. And joining me today for this session is Francesca Darmer, who is the Advisory Director, Global Head of Clinical at IT. And rather than doing a formal introduction, Francesca had wanted to keep it short and sweet and jump right into the mix here. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to you, Francesca. I hope you guys all have a great event. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen here.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And maybe I can just have you confirm 1 second that I am actually showing my full presentation here.
Yeah.
Can you see this?
Yeah.
Brilliant. So first of all, thank you so much. eTMF Week always makes me excited, so I'm very happy to be here today and to present on this topic. Now, we've already kind of gone through the title of the presentation today. Maybe just a little bit background about myself. I've been working with the industry for the past 20 years, I think. The last 10 years, I've been working for various clinical application vendors, and before that, I came from pharma. I actually started my whole career as a student help indexing and cataloging clinical content and documentation, and kind of taking care of various aspects of the TMF back then. We didn't even have an E in front of it until we actually moved into the eTMF and been working with it pretty much consistently throughout all those years then. So very excited to be here today. So today I want to start to talk a little bit about some of the key drivers for change that we see in the industry. I think this is important because when we are looking at new possibilities, especially with emerging technologies like AI, of course, there's a lot of drivers that's really pushing for change in general within the industry. And I just want to spend a few minutes kind of addressing those. The first thing is, of course, when we take a look at the way we have been conducting our clinical trials, that has really significantly changed. Not just think about the 20 years that I've been doing this stuff, but just in the last 5 years, for example, last handful of years, how significantly our world has really changed. Not just our clinical trial setup, but also the way we engage our different stakeholders. It used to be a very traditional setup in terms of, we had our sponsors, maybe we were working with a few partners, and our patient was something slightly far removed from ourselves as sponsors as well. But now we really see that picture changing, not just because when we look at some of the scientific advantages in R&D, some of the fields we're now engaging in, like gene therapy, personalized medicine, and so forth, it really requires require us to engage all our stakeholders in a very different way. We're suddenly much closer to our patient, much closer to the research side. We work within our more complex partner environments. So these are all something that kind of driving the changes within our businesses themselves. I would also say another aspect of this is really how we're engaging patients, not just because it's now actually a regulatory requirements that we continuously take patients, considerations or patient perspective into consideration, but really we're getting so much valuable information in that continuous feedback loop from the patient, and it really helps us to inform and develop our clinical trial set up much more efficiently. Another part of this is also really looking towards connectivity. Our partner landscape has really significantly changed. It's much more complex. We're working across many more stakeholders than we've done in the past or ever before, I would say. And this is also part of our need then to have greater need for operability between our partners, between the different systems, data and content, while still maintaining quality and oversight. A lot of organizations today are really looking to drive innovation through partnerships, whether or not it's sponsored to sponsor partnerships, whether it's sponsor an academia or a mix thereof, or even as it comes to mergers and acquisition. There's a large percentage of companies that's looking for these type of activities in order to increase their own innovation. And this means, of course, that connectivity is really essential for us as an industry to continuously drive our progress forward. The other thing which has always been a big thing in clinical, of course, is the compliance focus. But what's really interesting about this now is, of course, as our clinical trial setup changes, as we are much more engaged directly with the patients, we have a more complex partner landscape, of course. We're looking towards data as something that will really drive a lot of our decision making also on the clinical trials, and we're utilizing data in a very different way than we did just 5 or 10 years ago. And this means, of course, there's an increased regulatory focus on how do we manage that data, how do we manage from a patient privacy perspective, from a data integrity perspective, use and reuse, of course. And if we look across some of the initiatives with the regulators, like the EMA's Big Data Task Force, for example, we see development not just for us as an industry, but also the regulators are defining this space as we go along. And it's very interesting to see what's actually going on there. And then finally, of course, if we look at the technology that's really available to us now, it's very, very exciting times. Every time we have kind of progress within the technology area for our industry, I always get a little bit too excited, but this is really, I would say, the first time, at least from my personal perspective, we truly see technology that has the opportunity to significantly not just impact our processes, but foundationally transform them to something else. It allows us to really explore ways of working that we haven't really had the ability to investigate further before. So these are some of the major drivers for change that we see within the industry. Now, what this means for clinical, of course, we're really truly looking at this technology-enabled, data-driven clinical trial. It's a little bit long, but what that actually means is when we talk about technology-enabled and what we want to achieve within clinical, we have this notion of being able to fail faster or succeed sooner. Everyone that works within the industry, we know the numbers. We know how difficult it is to bring a product to market. We know the failure rates. We know the cost and the resources it takes and the amount of time it takes to actually achieve that. And what we are hoping to achieve with this fail faster, succeed sooner is, of course, enabling technology to help us identify programs, for example, trial designs that has the potential to not work, that maybe have a potential for failure, which we ourselves were not aware of before we started looking closer at the use of data, for example, to inform us better. And this is also where we use technology, for example, to being able to really enable us also using data in a way that also allow us to potentially track when we have the opportunity for success. So data can give us indication, not just looking at our own data, but actually looking at the industry as a whole. Imagine that we're working with a new trial design, being able to use data to better inform, well, has this trial design been done before, for example? Is this something we've done ourselves? Is this something that's done in the industry? And use data as part of really informing ourselves as to the potential success of something as early as possible. And then finally, of course, compliant and secure. This is just simply, this is a necessary fact. We have to incorporate that in all our thinking when it comes to utilizing technology in order to really enable our clinical trial conduct. Now, what has all this to do with the eTMF? I usually say, like, the eTMF in itself is actually fairly simple. It's some documents need to be filed, need to be inspection ready, but of course that's not the full story. What makes the eTMF quite complex is, first of all, the volume. You know, you can have studies that are very, very small, a couple of hundred documents, a couple of sites, and that's pretty much it. But you can also have mega trials. You can have trials that contain as many as 250,000 documents that works with over 50 countries and 500 plus sites. And even though most of us work with the TMF reference model, I think it's like 256, I think, artifacts at this moment. I've also worked with companies that, of course, has expanded that structure, and there's well above 800 different artifacts or document types, whatever you prefer to call it. And that, of course, adds this additional complexity when we start looking on how to efficiently manage and really work with this trial master file. The other part of that is, of course, the stakeholders. Pretty much any person involved in the clinical trial is somehow part of generating data and content that's part of that trial master file. As the sponsor, we're not just a sponsor, we're also individual departments. Clinical operations, medical affairs, data management, statistics, PV, so on and so forth. We have our external partners, our IECs and IRBs. We have our CROs. We have our research sites, patients, and so on and so forth. And that's just another component that really adds to that complexity of what makes the eTMF so challenging. Now, I did a little digging, of course, in preparation for this presentation here. And I have to say, I'm always blown away by some of these things you can find out there. So these are just examples of mega trials, where these are some of the 3 biggest trials out there, as far as I could Google myself towards it. So imagine having to manage a trial master file with 14,000 patients, or working across 50 countries, whether or not you're in China, India, South America, Germany, wherever you are. That added complexity, I would say it's pretty close to a nightmare, actually, if you have to have efficient, standard, operation behind your eTMF to ensure inspection readiness, to ensure quality and your general eTMF health. And this one probably takes wins the whole competition of being complex. This is the longest running study to date. I'm not trying to actually say what kind of study this is, but it started in November 1985. The internet had only been around for a couple of years and wasn't in full, really mainstream until the 90s. Imagine managing a trial like this from a TMF perspective. The amount of regulatory changes, the technology changes as part of that as well. And those complexities, how would you really do that? So the eTMF can be very simple. It rarely is. We have volume, we have a lot of different stakeholders, and we have a lot of additional complexities all mixed in within that. So it really, if we try to look at some of the things we are focusing on as an industry, trying to make the processes that causes us the most delay, trying to optimize those, well, looking at the eTMF actually makes a lot of sense, because behind the scenes of managing an eTMF, there's a lot of manual and very resource-heavy activities that really, of course, takes a lot of time and effort to comply with. Now, before I really go into what AI can do for the eTMF, I was kind of encouraged to give you a little bit of an introduction to what is AI, and this is all stuff you can Google. And I know a lot of people will know a lot more about AI than I do. I have to be honest about this. But what I think is interesting is that when we speak about AI today, it's still a little bit iffy exactly what it is, and how we use it, and how we use it within life sciences and for healthcare as an example. So of course, AI is the artificial intelligence, is the simulation of human intelligence processes by machines, especially computer systems. And it focuses on 3 cognitive skills: learning, reasoning, and self-correction. Now, I want to just quickly go through these different types of AI technology that we have here. Just to kind of demystify it a little bit. Well, the first one is really for automation, and this of course makes a lot of sense. It's really targeting those very repetitive, rule-based data processing tasks that traditionally really was done by human beings now, but where we see that AI can significantly optimize our processes, but also add in terms of increase our quality, for example, as part of that. Machine learning is another aspect of that, and I think machine learning and AI are probably the 2 terms that are used the most and interchangeably so. So this is really the science of being able to get a computer to act without programming. So it's about automation of predictive analytics. I touched a little bit on this before. A lot of the companies we currently work with, they are really looking to data and predictive analytics as a way to really figure out if we're running a trial design based on some parameters, how successful might that be? They're looking at their historic data, they're looking, so like study protocols, study reports, data sets, but they're also looking at external data, the data they get from the industry, for example. And using that data is then able to use predictive analytics to figure out, okay, do we actually think, based on all of this information, whether or not these programs will be successful or not? Machine vision, this is also something that is probably the most common to the eTMF already today. It's about being able to capture and analyze visual information, whether or not it's OCM extraction, for example, and being able to utilize that. I think the most common examples here are, we hear about cancer screenings, for example, being able to take a look at an image and analyze what that image shows, and then being able to actually give a diagnosis or and so forth in that sense. The natural language processing, this is what's probably the most interesting for our eTMF, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this, but it's of course being able to process human language. So when we have the technology really reading through a piece of content, being able to translate or analyze or recognize certain components of that, that's what belongs in that bucket here. And then finally, we have robotics here, which is really focused around, specifically or typically around manufacturing robots. And how we really can use that to again support otherwise very repetitive task. Now, this is by all means not all-inclusive. This is just a few examples, just to kind of give you a quick overview. One of the questions I usually get is, well, will AI take over, human tasks and human activities? And to some extent, yes, of course it will do that, but hopefully it is to our benefit, meaning that it's taking over tasks that doesn't necessarily provide us with a value add. And rather than spending a lot of time, scanning, indexing, and all of that, imagine if we could get technology to do that. Instead, we focus our energy on, for example, becoming inspection ready. This is a longer discussion, of course, but I do just want to give you a little bit of my personal perspective on that it's not necessarily about being afraid of losing our jobs, our task. It's more about changing into a focus that's much more value adding to our overall processes and the way we can support the clinical trial optimization. All right, so how is this really used in the industry? So this is just taking a look at general healthcare here. So drug discovery, I mentioned this a little bit before, is really being able to use data and see whether or not we can, reduce the cost of drug or treatment development, for example. trial patient identification, retention, and personalized treatment, this all kind of falls in the same bucket. Being able to use data to better inform ourselves, allow technology to help us maybe identify patients, for example, in a better way, figure out why we have a patient that stopped coming to visits is another one. Personalized treatments, there are programs out there in the industry that on cancer patients, for example, where they're using genomics to profile individual patients, and they can access databases that allow them to say, well, do we have another patient with a similar genomics profile that could potentially, where we can learn from their treatment history and so forth. And this is something that's actively in use today and being also worked at and continuously improved as well. Drug production, of course, this is more on the manufacturing side, but imagine when you have a big plant producing different types of drugs, of course, not just being able to verify the quality of the product, the manufacturing, but even also use the type of technology to say, okay, can we pick up trends that will give an indication on when a certain piece of machinery might break down or due to break down, and preempt that particular scenario, so when it actually happens, the system has automatically already ordered the spare parts to fix the machines and so forth. And this is how we're looking at how we can avoid disrupting our production by using this type of technology. And of course, also the patient experience is another one where I would digress a little bit for what's written here in the screen, and I think it's much more also about what we see example of is really, you know, we're also individual people, and our habits and our routines are different from individual to individual. Using technology as a way of tailoring the patient experience to that individual's preferences is another way that AI is also used within the industry today already. All right, so how does this really help within the eTMF? Now, if we look at larger trial master files, of course, really typically we'll find a lot of challenges in these multi-collaborative, high-volume environments, of course. First of all, when we work with multiple data sources, whether or not it's the different research sites, whether or not it's CROs, or mergers and acquisition, it of course significantly challenged our data standardization and our ability to efficiently intake these data and content that we really need to, for example, consolidate within the sponsor's trial master file. And this is, of course, we might have our own standards, we might have our own systems, but every one of these different stakeholders would have slight variations on that. They have their own standards, they have their own systems, and it usually takes incredible amount of time to really consolidate all of that into a format or a shape that actually makes sense for us as an individual organization. The next one here, in terms of external created content, you can read this in different ways. If we take the paper example of eTMF, but this could just as easily apply to just general data intake from various sources. But an eTMF, as long as we talk about paper in general, of course, it means the lack of data. When you sit with a paper, you have that piece of paper in your hands, but there are no data surrounding it. You have no idea who created it, how long it took to draft it, who reviewed it potentially, unless that's captured on a different piece of paper. You can't really tell whether or not, the signatures, how it was applied, and in which order, and those kind of things, if they fall into the same date. And of course, it also means that we don't necessarily have the accessibility. When something exists in a paper format, of course, it's no longer, or it's not accessible to more than the person that's sitting with it in their hands, of course. The other thing is that typically there's some activity in terms of needed for transit or transference of this content. So whether or not it's data or simply paper, that has to be, most likely needs to be shipped somewhere. It needs to be scanned, uploaded, indexed, QC'd, and all of these different things, of course. Whenever we talk about moving and transferring things, there's always a risk of, first of all, of non-compliance, because we are adding additional steps to something. And there's also a risk of loss or corruption during transit. I once worked on a study where there was a huge shipment of it. This is way back, I would say, but 10 years or so. There was a huge shipment of eTMF content coming in, and the package was actually lost in transit. And we lost, I don't know how many documents that were supposed to go into the TriMaster file simply in transit from, remote sites and into the headquarters for consolidation into the eTMF. So the more activities that we add to a process, of course, the more risk of non-compliance and the higher risk also of corruption during that transit. And most of these activities, we're talking paper or just general data, of course, requires some data enhancement or cleaning. Just because when we're looking at data and content that's being delivered, we need to upload it, we need to index it, and we see so many wide variety of regional differences. And that, of course, typically leads to very poorly classified, inconsistent eTMF content and data. Duplication, it always sounds very simple, but it's a huge problem of the TriMaster file. I remember when I worked with it really on a daily basis, the type of duplications you typically come across is never intended. It might be a CV that someone thought wasn't submitted is being submitted again from the same sites. It might be an IRB-IC package where someone submitted the actual submission of the package to the ethics committee. Then someone would submit the package with some kind of additional letter or with the letter approval. And all of a sudden, when you start really organizing your eTMF, you see many, many variations or copies of the same piece of content, of course. Identifying these duplicates are not always easy. That's one thing. But it's also cleaning it up is often very, or I would say at least semi-manual, and typically quite resource heavy as well. So of course, throughout all of this, the document management part, the tracking and retrieval capacity is challenged, and inspection readiness, of course, can really require significant manual oversight. And again, we have this, poor TMF quality and health. I think a lot of people would argue that their eTMF is spotless and it's all good and so on and so forth. So it's not just about, do we have inspection readiness? Do we have the right level of quality? But it's also the amount of time and resources it takes you to actually get there. And I think from our perspective here, really trying to optimize or transform our processes, then that is a very big question, or a very important question that we have to answer. And how can we not just, be inspection, but how can we do it in the most efficient way that doesn't significantly impact our resources and doesn't take a lot of time and effort? All right, so how can AI improve our eTMF health and quality in general? Well, first of all, what AI allows us to do, and I'm being very broad here, but it is, of course, being able to assess the data quality prior to intake. So imagine here you're working across, let's just say, multiple CROs for the simplicity of it. Each CRO will have a slightly different variation on standards. And you can do your best, of course, to ensure that your standards are being followed, or you can have processes in place that make sure that when you receive new content, that you take the time and effort then to standardize it to your expectations. In reality, though, that's something that's quite cumbersome to do. So what AI is, where AI allows you to do is basically do an automated assessment of the data quality even before it hits your eTMF. It allows you to go through thousands and thousands of line items and really flag if there's any data inconsistencies between what you expected to achieve and what have you achieved. Did you receive too much data? Was there a lack of data? Was there inconsistency in the use of data? That is something that then an AI can help you actually flag up front. It also allows you to enhance data, meaning and clean data based on predefined rules, libraries, and things like OCM extraction. What this really means is, let's say something simple like naming conventions for site personnel. If you have a Dr. John Smith, now you can specify that we need to have a name from that individual, but the many, many ways you can actually write this, whether or not it's J.Smith or, Smith, J, and so on and so forth, people can get incredibly creative when it comes to really capturing metadata, and having a specific standard kind of enforced within your organization, having an AI kind of protect that standard in terms of identifying first where the data inconsistency is. It can of course also make sure to transform the data that you receive, and it can verify that against the content of the actual document. So if you're relying on metadata in order to do your indexing, for example, here the AI will be able to take a look at the actual content of the document, say, well, this is not John Smith, this is Veronica something else, for example. Just to and it can really compare that also to your pick list and your available data libraries within your trial master file as well. The duplication, I mentioned this before, but here of course you have that automated, so that allows you to do duplication checks both in the actual content of the document but also semantical. So it can be based on metadata, or it can be based basically on the image of the content down to the individual pixel, basically. And what you get at the end result is, of course, a standardized and quality check data input. So by the time it's automatically transferred into your eTMF, a lot of the quality should already been verified, and you will have had cross checks against your content, against your standards captured within your system, and then you will have this information go into your eTMF itself. And that of course gives better quality and improves significantly your eTMF health upfront, with a minimization of manual resources to go in and support these processes. Now, this is just one use case. You don't have to read the whole thing, but just to kind of illustrate a little bit what this might actually look like if we look at the images on the right. So as I mentioned before, imagine working across multiple CROs. You have the CROs, they all dump their data, their content in a specific location. You will have the AI, and here the natural language processing, for example, all the rules library going and take a look at that content. It will flag inconsistencies. And this is where you have kind of a learning application where when there is a flag up front, of course, you will have human eyes go in and evaluate whether or not that flag is valid. And then, of course, since it's AI, it will then pick up and be taught for the next round that when you resolve a flag, how is that done? So this is another aspect of the use of this type of technology, that the first time you utilize it, let's say of a subset of like a 15,000 document, of course, maybe 80% of that will be automated, and the last 20% you will have some people going in and managing these flags. But over time, that amount of time and effort it takes to manually go in and correct mistakes and so forth, that will of course significantly increase. And that's one of the key kind of benefits of the use of AI, and in this instance here, NLP, for example. On top of that, of course, it's also a storage location temporary before it hits your eTMF, and there are certain kind of trends and so forth that you can actually report on even before it goes into your trial master file. So the result of this, well, as I mentioned, and this is very much an estimate, it completely depends on what are your different data sources, what is the level of quality, but this is what we typically see, that the upfront kind of, you know, the first POC or the first kind of batch you run through a solution like this, you can reduce it by around 80%, and then you still have 20% in terms of initial manual data cleaning and enhancement. It really helps you ensure that your corporate accepted data standards are really maintained across or enforced across your partners and different data sources as well. It also, of course, allows you that significant increase in both data quality and your overall bettering of TMF health. And what I really like about this, it only gets better. And this is, as I mentioned before, that's one of the key benefits of AI is, of course, it learns. It improves all the time. So every effort you put in from a manual perspective is something that adds value to the quality of the data in the long run as well. All right, so just one more slide. So where do we go from here? Most companies today will have some sort of digitalization strategy in place, or digital transformation strategy, or business transformation strategy in place. What's common across all of these strategies is data driven. But we then look at some of the data or some of the input we get from the industry. Actually, only 34% of the life science companies have confidence in their data. This doesn't really bode well when we are that dependent on data to really drive forward our innovation and drive forward the type of efficiencies we would like to see in our clinical trial conduct. So imagine for the eTMF, the amount of data and content that's captured within that. If we can start improving on that, when we can make sure that when you look at data, you can be completely confident that the level of quality, the accuracy of that data is something you can really rely on. What kind of impact might that actually have on our businesses in the long run? So with that, that was my very last slide. Thank you so much. I think I will stop sharing and then we will go to Q&A.
Absolutely. So I know that we have a couple of questions here, and what a great contextual background, certainly spanning over the years, and it's always about that story, which turns out pretty well. Maybe just a quick question for me, Francis, and in terms of AI, I know it's a technology that is quickly, coming up to speed. I don't think that it is the majority in the industry. What do you think is the outlook in terms of it becoming, let's say, a majority of the industry and adoption? Do you see it being adopted very quickly, taking considerable amounts of time before it becomes the norm? Or what's your perspective there?
It's funny. There's kind of some weird trends going on. Some of the organizations that I would typically, or not I, but would typically be classified as late adopters of technology are actually really quite advanced on the data side, meaning like the core applications like CTMS, eTMF, and so forth are not necessarily that mature in their usage, but they have very advanced data projects or data strategies in place and are actively utilizing already now AI, predictive analytics, big data, and so on and so forth. What I think is interesting and where the disconnect is we don't use it as much as I would expect compared to the benefit on something simple like an eTMF. And I think part of that is because when we hear AI, it sounds complicated. All of these things I mentioned before, it sounds super complicated, very expensive, high risk of failure. But in reality, AI today is quite accessible, and something like trying AI out in this format I showed here is actually not, first of all, it's fairly straightforward to set up. It may be 8 to 10 weeks in total. You can start up with 15,000 documents, and it's not expensive either. So compared to the potentials of how we can really utilize the technology, I think we haven't quite discovered that for eTMF yet, simply because when we think about it, it sounds complicated. We know they're doing it, but they do it somewhere else than the eTMF. So, but as soon as people catch that potential benefit, I think we're going to see a great uptake in that.
I hope so. It's very exciting. Without all the analogies to the doomsday of AI taking over, I think there are amazing efficiencies with technology for sure, and AI is that next level. And maybe, for me, maybe a half step back, Julia Williams, you asked a terrific question to maybe make sure that everybody is on the same page. Julia is asking, what is AI and NLP abbreviation? So maybe just a half step back for,
sorry, I think abbreviations of AI?
AI and NLP.
AI is artificial intelligence, and NLP is natural processing language, or natural language processing. I always mix those two up.
Very good, very good. And maybe just one last question before I jump into I guess the housekeeping, and before we conclude for our next networking break. You mentioned the ability for organizations to start off small and be able to implement these systems. And put in place a new process. Oliver Pierce must have read my mind. I was just about to ask, as you're making this transition, what opens the door to potential regulatory risks if this is going to be, something that is going to be new for organizations when it comes to security?
sorry, just to rephrase. So what is the risk of, if you're just starting on this journey and adopting it in this fashion for the eTMF, what is the risk from a regulatory perspective? Yeah, correct. Well, first of all, as everything else in the industry, it has to be something that's validated, right? We have to follow the same the GXP guidance that we already have. And also to remember, this is something that is, even before it hits your eTMFs, typically it increases your quality, but it doesn't omit, it doesn't omit your quality checks, it doesn't omit your inspection readiness checks and so forth. This is a step that allows you to consolidate volumes of data and content in an automated fashion, hopefully allowing you to spend more time on these, proper cross checks and so forth. My dream, though, going forward, not quite there yet, is really, I do see some of the things that we spend an incredibly amount of time on in terms of inspection readiness. I can easily imagine, it's also something we already talk about with our customers. Can you, for example, take some of the inspection readiness checks out of it? Are we able to cross-check content because it is accessible to us? Are we able to build rules that could really run a mock inspection based on those rules, because we know what kind of cross-checks we do when we do inspections? So for me, that's kind of the next steps, but we haven't quite gotten to there yet. So I see this as, I'm not talking about AI in general, I'm talking about AI for this particular use. I really see it as like extremely low risk, to be honest, because it's something that's already heavily used in other industry, and it's almost a common thing, just not on the eTMF yet.
Sure. Donna actually asks a really great question, and maybe some advice for those in attendance. The question is, can you talk a bit about the process that companies need to put in place to support AI?
The process companies, well, I mean, there's a big difference, right? Because we all know about the risk of AI in terms of being biased, for example, or it really depends on how are you using AI. There are some of the larger programs I'm involved with that has nothing to do with eTMF, I would say, but using predictive analytics, there's an ethical component of AI where this is something you have to take into consideration. If we leave that part out of it and just focus on this particular uses here, what people would have to focus on to prepare, obviously, first of all, have a good eTMF system in place. You want to have a, that's very basic. We want to have that in there. You have to have strong processes in there. You need to know, you need to know how to manage your eTMF. This doesn't solve problems if your basics are not already covered. This is just a way of accelerating some of your processes, right? And then, of course, you need to partner with, if you don't have internal AI knowledge, you need to partner with the right people in order to have that IT background, DXP background, and knowledge about AI in general. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I hope so. And maybe just tailing to that as we come up to time, first I want to thank you, so much for this, I would call it past, present, and future presentation that you delivered. I think it's incredibly insightful and very, very forward thinking. So I know we got to some of the questions. We didn't get to all of the questions. I believe you had provided us with your email address in the event that others want to reach out to you. I'll confirm with the group that it is fcda@nnit.com. And of course, we'll follow that up in writing so that in case you guys didn't catch that, you guys can get it. You can always email us as well at tmfweek@monitoring.com. So right now we're going to be transitioning into another one of those networking breaks, allow you guys to take a little bit of time to make sure that you're touching base with some of the real work that you have. The sessions have been incredibly insightful, and Francisca, thank you for joining us. In about
Thank you so much for having me.
Or so, we're going to be kicking off with an additional panel, an incredible topic as well. How does TMF health impact the study quality, which leverages on some of the points that you were making. We have 4 incredible speakers. You won't want to miss that. And so with that note, everyone, this will conclude our session. Thank you again, Francisca. It was great.
Thank you so much. Have a great day. Thank you.
Have a great day, everyone. Thank you so much.